Hello, welcome to the self-learning platform by Dr. Sushma Singh. Today we start Unit 7, John Locke. Our point of discussion is the state of nature and natural rights. We thus see that natural law constitutes an integral part of Locke's moral and political theory. It is central to his conception of the state of nature as well as of civil society. The state of nature, as we know, is the stock in trade of all contract theories of the state. It is conceived as a state prior to the establishment of political society. In Locke's version, it is pre-political thought, not pre-social, for men are essentially social by nature. The state of nature, far from being a war of all, is a state of peace, goodwill, mutual assistance, and self-preservation. It has law of nature to govern it. This law obliges everyone, and reason, which is that law, teaches all mankind who will but consult it, that being all equal and independent, no one ought to harm one another in his life, health, liberty, or possessions. For man being all the workmanship of one omnipotent and infinitely wise Maker, all the servants of one sovereign Master, sent into the world by his order, and about his business they are his property, whose workmanship they are, made to last during his, not one another's pleasure, and being furnished with like faculties, sharing all in one community of nature, there cannot be supposed any such subordination among us that may authorize us to destroy one another, as if we were made for one another's uses, as the inferior ranks of creatures are for ours. In the state of nature, man have natural right to life, liberty, and property. These rights are inalienable and inviolable, for they are derived from the law of nature, which is God's reason. Everyone is bound by reason not only to preserve oneself, but to preserve all mankind, in so far as his own preservation does not come in conflict with it. Again, men are free and equal, and there is no commonly acknowledged superior whose orders they are obliged to obey. Everybody is the judge of his own actions, but though the natural condition is a state of liberty, it is not a state of license. Nobody has a right to destroy himself and destroy the life of any other man. But where some nobler use than its bare preservation calls for it. Because there is no common judge to punish the violation of natural law in the state of nature, every individual is his own judge and has the executive power of punishing the violators of the law of nature. This violation may be against him or against mankind in general. But when men are judges in their own case, they cannot be impartial. There are also other inconveniences in the state of nature. There is no established, settled, known law to be the standard of right and wrong. There is no impartial judge to decide cases of dispute, and finally, in the state of nature, there often wants power to back and support the stance when rights and to give it due execution. In other words, there are three lacunas of inconveniences in the state of nature: want of a legislature authority to declare law, of an impartial judge to decide cases of violation of law, and lack of an impersonal executioner of the law. Thus, we find that the state of nature, which, while it is not a state of war, is also not an idyllic condition, and therefore it has to be superseded sooner or later. Conflicts and uncertainties are bound to arise on account of the selfish tendencies of the human nature. The state of nature is always in danger of being transformed into a state of war, where everyone is the judge in his own case and has the sole authority to punish. Peace is bound to be threatened. Though Locke sometimes draws upon historical evidence to support his concept of the state of nature, the idea is essentially a rational construct, a hypothesis to explain the nature and foundation of political society. A more controversial point that emerges from Locke's account of the state of nature is its dual character. Writers like Leo Strauss and Richard Cox have argued that basically Locke's theory is a restatement of the Hobbesist view of human nature, disguised and couched in a more palatable language. These writers believe that the state of nature in Locke, which is described as a state of peace, goodwill, mutual assistance, and preservation, turns out, on analysis, to be a state of war on account of the oppression of passions, a situation for which the only remedy is the creation of civil society. They charge Locke not only of inconsistency, but also of hypocrisy and of having hidden meaning. Professor McPherson has found two conflicting notions of Locke's state of nature, one before and the other after the invention of money, accusing Locke of bourgeois mentality. These interpretations, however, are highly selective and too restrictive. They ignore the real spirit of Locke and go against his clearly expressed opinions. They have rightly been rejected by Arcelf, Ashcraft, and Salinger, scholars who have written on Locke without any ideological bias or philosophical presupposition and self-professed esoteric methodology. Another important concept in Locke's political philosophy is that of natural right to life, liberty, and property. These natural rights are derived from natural law and are limited by it. The freedom of man and liberty of acting according to his will is grounded on his having reasons, which is able to instruct him in that law he is to govern himself by and make him know how far he is left to the freedom of his own will. The end of law is not to abolish or to restrain, but to preserve or enlarge freedom. For in all the states of created being, where there is no law, there is no freedom. Right to property is intimately connected with right to life and liberty as its necessary consequence. Sometimes Locke sums up all natural rights in the right to property, but property is not his exclusive concern. Life and liberty are more important. Man creates property by mixing his labor with the objects of nature. In the beginning, all things were held in common. But common ownership is not sufficient to provide men with means of life and satisfy their needs. Man must mix his labor with the resources provided by nature to enable him to make use of them in a more efficacious and profitable way. Since man owns his own person, his body and limbs, the object with which he mixes his labor becomes his own property by right. This is the origin of the famous labor theory of value, common to both the classical and the Marxian economics. Locke does not believe that man has an unlimited right of appropriation. There are three important limitations on ownership of property. The first, called labor limitation, is that one can appropriate only that much of common resources with which he has mixed his labor. The second limitation, the sufficiency limitation, enjoins man to appropriate only as much as is required by him and leave enough and as good for others. The third limitation, known as the spoilage limitation, requires that man should acquire a thing only if he can make good use of it, since nothing was made by God for man to spoil or destroy. If one takes more, he invades his neighbor's share. He is prohibited by the law of nature. Many critics have found these limitations mostly verbal, which are rendered quite odious in the later stage of the state of nature, especially after the invention of money. About the supposed labor limitation, Macpherson critic is that it was in fact never seriously entertained by Locke, but he has been read into his theory by those who have approached it in the modern tradition of humanist liberalism. The introduction of wage labor, that is, the right to purchase the labor of others on payment of wages, makes it possible and rightful for a man to appropriate the product of other men's labor. Then Locke also gives a man a right to be quit his property. This is according to Macpherson an indication of his mean Locke's departure from the medieval view and acceptance of the bourgeois view expressed so tersely by Hobbes. Introduction of money, which allows men to exchange goods for money, removes the limitation imposed by the non-spoilage principle. Macpherson concludes that Locke not only justifies the right to unequal property, but approves of unlimited individual appropriation. Locke is thus presented as an ideologue of possessive individualism, of market economy, and the dictatorship of the bourgeois. He is seen as a typical representative of the spirit of capitalism. Plum's criticism is based more on logical than ideological grounds. He points out three major defects in Locke's theory of property. In the first place, the limits he sets on appropriation, the injunction to let nothing spoil or go to waste is either irrelevant or inadequate, for it makes sense only under conditions which are in fact rare. Secondly, the right to bequest, which Locke tactily includes in the right to property, does not derive either from the right to preserve life and liberty or from the right to set aside for your own exclusive use what you have mixed your labor with. And thirdly, it does not follow even if your mixing your labor with something gives you a right to use it or to exclusion of people who have not mixed their labor with it, that your being the first to mix labor with something gives you the right not to share it with anyone who subsequently mixes his labor with it. The ideological interpretation of Locke in terms of capitalist economy and the dictatorship of the bourgeois have been challenged by the Ishan Berlin, Alan Ryan, Martin Slager, Richard Ashcraft, Hans Ersleff, John Dunne, and others. They argue that the Macpherson's view overlooks the overriding role of natural law and the idea of common good that it implies. Locke is too much of the medievalist and believer in God to ignore the dictates of divine reason and to espouse unabashedly the cause of the rising capitalist class, whose ethos is cutthroat competition for wealth accumulation, resulting in class conflict and misery for the have-nots. George H. Sabine is perhaps more to the point when he says he left standing the old theory of natural law with all its emotional connotation and almost religious compulsions, but He completely changed, without knowing it, the meaning which the term had in writers like Hooker. Instead of law enjoying the common good of society, Locke set up a body of innate, indefensible individual rights which limit the competence of the community and stand as bars to prevent interference with the liberty and property of private persons. Macpherson paid as little attention as Strauss did to the fact that no one among Locke's contemporaries read or understood his argument from these postulated standpoints, or to the fact that the Locke personally subscribed to and identified his own position with those religious beliefs he was presumably advancing as a sop to lesser minds, or that he was writing in defense of revolutionary political action and religious dissent positions adhered to by a very small minority of his contemporaries, which did not appeal to the established property owners whose interest he was supposed to be looking after. Ashcraft. Equally damaging to Macpherson's case was his failure to provide the historical and sociological evidence necessary to establish his claims regarding the kind of society 17th century England was, since the more inappropriate the model or society formulated by Macpherson as a descriptive characteristics of Locke environment, the more difficult it becomes to associate that model with Locke's intentional purpose in writing the two treatises. In a similar vein, Martin Slager argues that limitations on private property mentioned by Locke are never rendered illusory, either by the invention of money or by the admission of landed property in the interest of more efficient production. We cannot ascribe to Locke the view that due to the contrivance for the more effective exercise of rights of property, positive law could be contained property accumulation in accordance with the natural law. The right to property is the prototype of all natural laws, rights. They are freedom sanctioned by natural law, and freedom is protected and bounded by positive law in all spheres of action. Professor John Donne, in his remarkable work, The Political Thought of John Locke, has offered an interpretation of Locke which is diametrically opposite to Macpherson's account. According to Donne, the Lockean social and political theory is to be seen as the elaboration of Calvinist social values. In the absence of a terrestrial focus of the theological authority and in response to a series of popular challenges, Locke saw the rationality of human existence, a rationality which he spent so much to his life in attempting to vindicate as dependent upon the truth of religion. Observes in contrast with the alienated modern conception of the context of political agency and the predominantly instrumental view of its character, which dominate modern political thinking. Locke combines a radically individualist conception of both the human significance and the rationality of political agency with a wholly unalienated conception of its social context. Because this conception of political agency depends for its structure and stability on a personal relation between the individual human agent and the deity. It can scarcely be adopted as a basis for grounding modern political identities. In a carefully argued and exhaustive study, John Simons comes to the conclusion that Locke certainly condemns covetousness, contrary to the claim of Strauss' natural right, and there is no indication that he intends to defend a right of unlimited accumulation. But neither does he take the use of money and its creation of substantial inequality to be contrary to the God's will, or to end all legitimate appropriate under the rules of natural property. Locke says Simons occupies the middle ground, calling neither for unfettered accumulation of property nor for radical redistribution of holdings. Locke's theory of property seems to be oscillate between the large accumulation consistent with the sufficient amount of regulation and determination of land ownership by political authority in the interest of inequitable distribution. Though one cannot attribute to him a doctrine of differential rationality socially and politically favoring the propertied class, it can hardly be denied that the whole tenor of his argument goes in favor of those who own large property as compared with ordinary citizens. A neat summary of Locke's theory can be given as follows in the words of the Peter Laslet. Even the managed control of property by political authority can be reconciled with the doctrine of two treaties, and as Professor Wiener has pointed out, Locke nowhere complains against the complicated regulations of his mercantilist age in terms of property rights. If not complete communism, certainly redistributive taxation, perhaps nationalization could be justified on the principles we have discussed. All that would be necessary is the consent of the majority of the society, regularly and constitutionally expressed, and such a law would hold even if all the property owners were in the minority. Laslet further says that it is gratuitous to turn Locke's doctrine of property into the classic doctrine of the spirit of capitalism, whatever they may be. In fact, of course, Locke was neither a socialist nor a capitalist, though it is fascinating to find element of both attitudes of ours in his property doctrine, more perhaps in what he left out or just failed to say than in the statement themselves. He was not even an advocate of land and land ownership as the basis of political power to be represented in a nation's councils. For all his enormous intellectual and political influence in the 18th century, he was, in this respect, a barren field for anyone who wished to justify what once was called being obligatory. But he did not use his property doctrine to give continuity to the political society, to join generation to generation. To wind up this lecture, and thank you so much for your attention.